Gallaudet University presents.
I am a deaf interpreter. I've been interpreting for far too long now. Almost, 22 years now. And as to the question of where I've received my training in deaf hearing interpreting teams, I've actually had to learn on the job because some 22 years ago, there simply wasn't any such thing. There were hearing deaf teams happening in isolation at one conference or another. But there was no formal training to be had in terms of how to work with the deaf and hearing team. So all of that learning had to be done on the fly in terms of interpreters seeing and agreeing to work in deaf hearing teams. And as Carolyn said, it was as dumb as could be to go ahead and assume that we could do it without any training, but nonetheless, we went about it and learned as we went. And the training developed because of that learning sometime later. When anytime there's different sorts of settings that I've worked at, in for example, in court settings, mental health settings, conference interpreting, medical interpreting settings, I've worked in deaf hearing teams. And now I have worked in all of those settings, and really almost all possible settings in deaf hearing teams now. Hello there. I'm Beth Rich. And I've also been working as an interpreter for about 24 years. In terms of deaf and hearing teams, though, for about the past 15. And I started working with deaf people who had some particular language challenges in rural Maryland, perhaps, who may have lived in isolation. And working with deaf interpreters in these communities was my first experience with deaf hearing teams. And that ran the gamut all the way to court settings and law enforcement situations. But likewise, in terms of training, I think perhaps 4 or 5 years ago might have been the first trainings I saw available. And I took one workshop in San Diego, California, that I remember was on deaf hearing teams. And that was probably the very first training that I had for working in that kind of a team. But I would say similarly, I've learned by really on-the-job training.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kerri Ball. I've been working as an interpreter for about 7 years, and I've probably been working in deaf hearing teams for the past 5 years. So I've done classroom interpreting, worked with deaf interpreters who are working with close vision clients and so forth. So mostly that's where I've worked with deaf and hearing teams where I'm not necessarily the feed interpreter, but that interpreter is going off of my interpretation. And then the other situation is in law enforcement, so DPS or CPS, working with children, working with the police department. And so that's mostly the experience I've had. And again, I haven't had a whole lot of training. Similarly, I've learned on the job. But I am fortunate to have graduated from the MAI program, the interpreting program here at Gallaudet, and they had a one-day workshop where Carolyn actually came and presented her research, and interpreters came and gave us a sense of what it was like to work in a deaf and hearing team, and then we were able to see that modeled and then talk more about it. But it was a very brief training, and again, mostly I've learned on the job. I think I started interpreting in 1999.
And your name?
Oh, I apologize. I'm Geno Gooby. You're right. I am not Steve Walker. Steve Walker is the one, the handsome guy sitting over here to my right. So anyway, I am Geno Gooby, and I started interpreting in 1999. And I'd say the most percentage of my work has been in deaf and hearing teams. And I'm originally from Arizona, and so the original work that I did was in court, working with foreigners, maybe deaf people who came from Mexico or other places where ASL was their fourth language. I've worked in law enforcement, worked at various conferences on platform. So I've worked going into both American Sign Language as well as International Sign Language. And again, like everybody else, I've learned on the job and just had to learn by trial and error. So each experience has informed where I am today. And like Beth said, I had a similar situation in San Diego. I went to a conference. Again, Carolyn presented there, and I went to her training. And I have noticed in the past few years there have been more and more workshops offered related to deaf and hearing teams. And I am a junkie, I have to admit, so I've gone to as many as I can. So I've built my knowledge from on-the-job experience, as well as trying to develop some tools for approaching the work. And then some questions arise from those trainings where I can really add that to my plethora of experiences. Okay, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. So one common theme that we see here, obviously, is the lack of training. So those of you out there that feel like you haven't had any training and can't do the work, clearly it's a sad but true fact, and we hope that that will change in the near future. So I'd like to ask all of you, especially the hearing interpreters, are there situations that you feel you need a CDI? It is necessary to have a CDI, and yet the coordinator of that event or whoever is there is not in support of that. Can anybody talk to how you've advocated for using a CDI?
Well, I do often explain that CDIs add a greater level of accuracy. And it's also situational. If we're working with a minor child, or perhaps working with someone who was born in another country, American Sign Language might be their second, third, fourth language. So for a number of those reasons, I would depend on working with a certified deaf interpreter. And if a CDI is there, then I would have the CDI speak to their role and then simply interpret that for the benefit of the hearing participants.
I guess I've been really fortunate because I began interpreting when there was already that expectation that there'd be a CDI on the team for law enforcement specifically. So at Gallaudet, it is their protocol to have a deaf interpreter on the team at all times. So when I came into the field, I didn't have to be the one to advocate for the necessity of having a deaf interpreter. I've also coordinated a number of events where we have deaf interpreters on the team already. So I've inherited this coordinating job, and I haven't had to do any convincing of the need for the deaf interpreters. That's for various events, conferences, and so forth. So I think I've been very fortunate in that regard.
Right. It should be said that here at Gallaudet, there's not as much convincing to be done. Most already understand the benefit of it. And actually, if we look back some time ago, the decision of whether or not to bring in a certified deaf interpreter often rested with that hearing interpreter. And at that time, it would then be up to that hearing interpreter to then justify and bring forth a rationale for that, because that deaf interpreter wouldn't be present up until that point. Once the deaf interpreter is then present, that can often beg the question of why multiple interpreters are needed. And then often the deaf interpreter comes into the picture in terms of explaining the purpose of that deaf interpreter. But I don't often see how that preliminary communication happens before I've been requested and attend an event with the hearing interpreter. But when I do attend an event with a hearing interpreter, that's when, as the deaf interpreter, we as an interpreting team have to talk about who should best lead that discussion in justifying or advocating for the provision of service, including a deaf interpreter. And that's where deaf interpreters then have learned to work with those hearing participants and put forth that rationale or justification.
At one workshop that was actually taught by Adam Bartley, and there were a lot of hearing interpreters who talked about the difficulty of making that argument. So they'd say it's the weakness either of the interpreter or of the consumer, but his recommendation was it's actually important to talk about the situation itself, whether it's the context, oppression involved, people involved. It is the situation that requires a professional CDI. And that was something that really stuck with me, that it helps a lot to be very neutral in the situation rather than saying, I have deficiencies and that's the reason for a CDI, or it's about the client. It's much more about the situation rather than the interpreter or the client. All right, so the next question is for everyone on the panel. Before you actually go to the job, how do you prepare? Do you sit down and talk about various cues? What does your preparation look like on your team? And I'm talking specifically about deaf hearing team and how your preparation may be different than it is with another team member who may be both deaf teams or hearing teams.
Well, preparation is absolutely a must. I cannot imagine a deaf and hearing interpreting team coming together without such prep and going forward with any kind of reasonable work. We absolutely need to know what the environment of the job is, what the work itself is going to look like. If, for example, this is a platform interpreting situation, then the process is going to work somewhat differently. The relationship with the consumer and clients are going to look very different than they would in a direct interpreting situation. So we have to make sure that our schemas are in line with each other so that we have worked out how we're going to take turns with both the person giving the source language text and the interpreting team. We also have to have some discussion about error correction, how I'm to be informed of an error in my interpretation or they in theirs, so that they actually have that entree to interrupt my interpretation and give me, as the interpreter standing on platform, a cue that there needs to be a correction made. So where those corrections go, in which direction, all of that has to be worked out prior to the teaming. And I can also be informed about the pacing of the speaker, and so that I can pass that information along or incorporate that into my interpretation. Perhaps there is a high tone in the source language text that indicates a level of frustration or anger. That then needs to be incorporated into my interpretation. And all of that work requires some discussion prior to the job so that we're on the same page and are working from the same sort of schema about the work.
I would agree. Oftentimes during our prep sessions, we may talk about who's involved, what sign names may be talked about, what the context is, but in working with the deaf hearing team, it's much more in depth. We need to talk about what we would do if various situations may arise. So we have another layer of discussion that needs to happen, and there is a layer of respect that is necessary in order to work together. We both support one another and need to talk about what type of support we need in that situation from the other interpreter. So again, talking about cues in terms of the source text, the tone of the source text. We need the hearing interpreter to cue us whether maybe the source text is much more angry than we're conveying, et cetera.
And I think there's different kinds of preparation and different steps to that preparation process. In a deaf hearing team, if they're going to prepare with the speaker then for a platform job, for example, then the three will need to meet and have a discussion with the speaker And then after that, the deaf hearing team themselves need to have a further discussion about the content, any issues that they can see is likely to come up, what the cues will be within the team, how they'll work out the length of pause hold structures, how we're going to work together as a whole. All of that bears further discussion, regardless of how experienced the interpreters are working in the field or working with each other. There's still an extra layer there. There are additional factors to that preparation in terms of what the preparation includes and how long they need prepare.
I guess also talking about how to make clarifications. So distinguishing myself from the source text. I work in law enforcement, and most often that's not on platform. That's a legal setting. And so it's very important to be clear who's asking the question. Is it myself as the interpreter, or is it the officer asking the question? And so we may talk about what types of cues, whether I point to myself or I lean, to indicate that it's me asking the question. So I may be asking the deaf interpreter for some clarification. And I need to talk with my team about what kind of style they would like to move forward with, what works the best for them, what works the best for me. And oftentimes if we work with somebody who's never had experience, it's different than those who have experience. So I have one example when I was interpreting for a funeral, and we had 2 deaf and hearing teams, and the deaf person had said they didn't have a lot of experience with church and music and so forth, so they wanted me to make the feed in ASL. And I do have a lot of experience in church from growing up and whatnot, but I don't necessarily know what all the words mean. So I had my hearing team feed the English in my ear, the meaning, so that I could sign it in ASL to the deaf person on platform. And so really we have to talk about each person's skills and what they bring to the job and how we work together to balance out those needs.
These are great examples. I see one example of how the body shift in conjunction with pointing to oneself indicates where that clarification is coming from. And others also that I've noticed are, for example, meeting with a speaker to clarify or meeting to discuss the...
So maybe we've met in advance to take a look and prepare together. So one time I knew, we both knew a joke was going to happen, and all I had to do as the feed interpreter was to say, it's time for the joke, and then the deaf interpreter could take it from there. Another time there was a poem that was going to happen, and we sat together, talked about the translation, how that would be interpreted, and when the time came in real time, all I had to say was, it's time for the poem. And then the deaf interpreter could move with that and just do the interpretation. And of course, a lot of people looking at this from the outside thought, my goodness, how does the deaf interpreter know all this about the poem? But it was just an amazing experience to be able to give that one little cue, it's time for the poem, and have them move with that. So the next question is, how do you like to be fed? This is to the deaf interpreters. Do you prefer the feed interpretation to be in ASL or more in English word order?
Once again, that goes back to the assignment itself. It's certainly not one size fits all in either case. It depends on the requirements of the job, and those can run the gamut. In a platform interpreting situation, as opposed to a doctor's office where you're engaged with a client who is a language-challenged client, for example, those processes will be quite different. So in the medical office, they will be using much more consecutive interpreting. And on the platform setting, it's much less likely to be consecutive if it's fast-paced. Now, if it's an international conference, then you may have opportunities for consecutive interpretation. So I may want the ASL feed in the doctor's office and the English feed in the plenary platform setting. I may want the English feed in one setting so that I can then go about that interpretation in my own mind. On the other hand, in one platform situation, I may prefer an ASL feed so that I can put further energy into working that into international sign. It also depends on the pacing of the source language text. If that's quite a laid-back pace, then I can see that the feed interpretation can then switch over to English, which gives me more freedom to work with the interpretation in my own time. I can't simply say that there's a one-size-fits-all for my work in deaf hearing teams. It depends on both pacing and setting and the sense that the hearing interpreter who's giving me the feed has of their own abilities and their own pacing. What's important is to make sure that all of these factors are in sync and that we can adjust them on the fly as we go as those environmental factors change. Pacing, for example, as it speeds up, I can become more conscious of that and then work with that information in my interpreting process.
I would concur that it depends on the situation. And it also depends on the cognitive load. If it is dense information, then it's nice to have a processed product that I can then work from and process a bit more. If it's consecutive interpreting, then English is more of a possibility. I do like to see the actual words that are being used in English, but of course it depends on the situation. Okay, so the next question is, in your experience, have you noticed that there are certain people who you work with very well and others that you may not work well with? So what would the ideal team look like? You know, what would the ideal team look like? Well, I'd say, again, I think trust is the absolute foundation for this work. We must have mutual respect for one another. There are some hearing interpreters who may disagree with my interpretation, and others may feel like they cannot because I'm a native signer. However, I would like to know if errors occur. We're working together. Now, there's some situations where the deaf interpreter may be signing in English, and they want the hearing interpreter to follow their mouthing, so there isn't a whole lot of trust. But once there is trust established, then we can follow through on however way we've agreed. So there have been times where, for whatever reason, the hearing interpreter is told not to sign, and that interpreter includes me as part of the team. So they lower their hands and sign in a very secretive way, and there's a very positive outcome when I am included, when we are an equal team.
Your question actually makes me look back at my experience and see where I've worked with very well respected and very talented interpreters where I would have predicted that the team would have gone as smoothly as possible and yet failed to do so. That really begs the question of why that happens. Does that failure for it to gel, if you will, lie with me or with them? So I'll get back to addressing that in a moment. But also we can look at some interpreters who have, some moderate level of experience, and I may have started out the job quite nervous about how well this would go, and yet it smooth sailing all the way. So if we look at both of these instances, and in fact, a third possibility of where we expect to work together but haven't yet, but have some time to prepare and work with that give and take, if you will. As Geno said, having that time to establish that trust, knowing that we are here for the work. The work is not about me and it's not about you. It's about what we can produce together. And it is, in fact, a privilege to help. By critiquing, we are truly helping. That's not criticism. It's a true critique of the work that helps each of us improve and enhances the product. So in basketball, for example, how can a player know whether he is, a natural, if you will, as a basketball player? That actually takes more than simple skill. Sometimes someone can be a pro basketball player without ever having actually been a pro basketball player. I want to be a pro basketball player, but I just don't necessarily have it. That begs the question of what that unknown id is. And that really is comprised of everything we've talked about. the research on all of those cues and features that Carolyn just talked about, attention, understanding how we work with attention, where our feed is, when we're attending to the feed. Have we forgotten to attend to the person we're working with in that team? Very often the hearing interpreter forgets to attend to me as the deaf interpreter, and so that can either build a bridge of attention and consciousness between us or tear that bridge down. We have to actually have those cues already laid out so that we can have that relationship and produce that project. Sometimes that happens without any prior training that can be pointed to or ascribed to for that success. I would just echo the remarks that have already been made. The experience working together truly does help in that. And I don't know that I have much more to add than that at the moment, but trust is absolutely vital.
Right. I think I'm fortunate to work in a place where most interpreters do have this experience. We've worked with the same interpreters on a daily basis. We've learned together from our mistakes. We make one mistake one day and we're able to adjust so that we don't make that mistake again, and then our work is effective. So we constantly work together and then debrief afterward to talk about how we can improve our working relationship. That also builds on trust, and both of us are equally responsible for the work product, so it's very important for us to be able to correct one another and talk about that so that we can continue to be a better team and improve on that product as well as the teaming.
One other thing that comes to mind, actually, is the notion of ego and how necessary it is for ego to be set to the side in this work, that the work be paramount. The two of you in this team are working together to create a product, neither one more than the other. The product is what's important, and that does require that ego simply be put to the side.
Okay, so we've actually received 2 questions remotely. They are very similar from our remote audience, and I will put the 2 together. So basically, they live in areas that are far from Washington, D.C., where there aren't a whole lot of CDIs. And maybe there are a few situations in law enforcement or the hospital where people do know to call a CDI, but in other situations, they don't use CDIs. So the question is, 1, where do you find a CDI? And 2, how do you convince the people in that setting to utilize the services of a CDI?
That's a tough question. And unfortunately, the numbers of certified interpreters in the United States are incredibly small as compared with the numbers of RID certified hearing interpreters. There's some 15,000 of those, but we just haven't really gotten there. There may be, when I came into it, maybe 30 deaf interpreters, and now still less than 200. So they are few and far between. But when you talk about some of these remote areas or rural areas where there are no deaf interpreters to be found, when a situation arises where you see the need, there are a number of different takes on that. One notion may be that there are no skilled interpreters who could work in that setting, so you do the best you can with the resources that are there. And that does happen. I'm not excusing it, but there may not be any deaf interpreters in the area. And then those hearing interpreters within that area also have to really have the knowledge and power to be able to explain to the court that this case that is before the court requires that we bring in a CDI from another location. We simply temporarily suspend the proceedings so that we had the opportunity to bring this necessary resource. And I wish that we had an equal number of deaf interpreters that was commensurate with the need. It's simply not. We're not yet to that point. So that requires all of us to work all the much harder to increase the numbers of deaf interpreters so that they can be accessible across the country. It's not an easy answer to a difficult solution, but there's no easy answer to be had right now.
2 thoughts come to mind. The First is when we talk about the number of CDIs that may be available, unfortunately, there aren't very many. And then also the job opportunities for CDIs. There are some people who are very interested in becoming CDIs, and yet there may not be jobs available in their locale, and so they move to a different career. And then when there is a need, unfortunately, they are not available because they're working in a different job. Now, we do work in the technological age, and technology is changing every day, and so there are other possible options in today's world. We have iPads, we have FaceTime, which, you know, so that we can use interpreters remotely, and of course it's not ideal, but if it is done properly and very carefully, I can see where that can be useful. And then in terms of making the argument and convincing that setting to use CDIs, I don't think that that's ever going to be an easy task, especially in regard to the, well, in regard to the legal setting or the mental health setting, it's a whole lot easier than in other settings. Because, of course, we don't want anybody to be falsely accused or found guilty and put into jail for false reasons. So it's a whole lot easier to make the argument there. So for lack of a better word, we need to just know how to push people's buttons. We need to know how to convince them that the use of a CDI is extremely crucial. So if we're talking about, you know, a doctor's appointment, we need to convince them that in order to come up with the right diagnosis, you need to know all the specifics of the information, and having a CDI will make sure that all those specifics are communicated. And then they are also liable. So we need a language specialist to assist with communication, and if we don't, there are, you know, it's possible that there will be negative outcomes as a result of that. So those are just a few little tidbits that I may share in specific situations. I'm thinking more of a long-term solution. Of course, we want to encourage young people to go into the field. We see skills. We want them to go get the degree, get the certification, have credibility so that they can go back to those locations and work as a CDI. You know, maybe now we have a BA, MA, and a doctorate in interpreting, so I think that we should really encourage young folks to get their degree in interpreting, and then hopefully those people will go fill in the gaps, and that could be a more long-term solution. Now, we, of course, have many other questions, but I will take a moment to turn toward the audience and see if those present in the room have questions. None? I don't know. You all are sleeping, maybe? All right, I will throw out one more question, but I am going to come back to you all, so think about what types of questions you may have.
Oh, you have a question there.
Oh, good, okay. So the question is, if CDIs are hired as well as hearing interpreters, does it need to be 4 interpreters? Can it only be 2? How do you make that determination of how many teams are necessary? So if we're talking about maybe a college class, maybe a 3-hour class, for example, can you have 2 interpreters, or is it necessary to have 4? How do you actually make that determination and then convince those who are hiring you?
Well, from a financial cost, we see that 4 absolutely is double the cost of 2, and that's often what's cried against. But as Geno explained, we can frame it for the listener so that they see the liability of not going ahead and using that money to expending the money on the team of 4. And we can talk to them about the benefits of the team interpreting setup. In court or mental health or law enforcement situations, they tend to be much more amenable to that because they're so much more attuned to the liability they hold. In other settings, such as college classroom environments, that's very different. Here at Gallaudet, I can say that we typically don't have to work so hard to convince others of the need. But outside of here, we can often see where finances come into play much more strongly, so that you may have 2 hearing interpreters and 1 deaf interpreter assigned in a particular setting, or 2 deaf and 1 hearing. That often requires a good deal of negotiation. But you know, often we also have to consider the precedent we set by accepting a less than ideal team or setting. And wherefore required for should be asked for and required to accept the job. I don't have a really simple answer for it.
Right, I would say that there isn't always the need for 2 full teams. And like you said, oftentimes we may have 2 deaf interpreters, 1 hearing, or vice versa. So there are various combinations that may work depending on the situation and the setting. So there is no one answer. All right, I think we're all warmed up a bit. Hopefully you're ready for some challenging questions. So I know that oftentimes problems arise when you're working in a deaf hearing team. Can you give me an example of why problems may arise and how you solve those problems? Or do you never have any problems arise? So I pose that to our panelists. Well, I would say it's impossible to have any situation where you don't have any kinks in the process. The dynamics are ever changing, and we are constantly being required to adjust to those changing dynamics. So again, I go back to the foundation that holds us together. And that's where the debriefing becomes very important, so that we can sit down and talk about what the challenges were and come together so that we understand one another, and next time we can have a better approach. So that foundation of trust is where it starts. If something didn't go well, I trust that my team and I are both working as hard as we can. We're going to move forward with the job at hand and then talk about it afterward to come to resolution. And I think that that's just one great thing about the job.
If there's an opportunity for all 4 of the interpreters on a team like that to work together in support of each other, that actually helps a great deal, because you can work across teams to solve some of those dynamic problems. And sometimes the shifting of those teams actually is, or natural pauses in the event allow for the team to dialogue and talk about whether or not we need to shift their language product so for the audience a little bit, something of that sort. Periodic check-ins are important. And then, as Geno said, debriefing after the job is very important. Sometimes, though, time simply doesn't permit. If that happens, what's most important is that we be flexible. We see what we can fix when we can fix it, and not hold on to that. Simply focus on what we can do at the moment, choose among those varying demands and variables, and work with what we can. And sometimes teams are put together in the cold. This happened to me once at a national conference, and not by choice, not by preference, but each of us in our own right were experienced interpreters. But the hearing interpreter working with me had never worked a conference with deaf hearing teams. They had worked other settings other than conferences were under their belt. But as the 2 of us came together, the first few minutes of working together as a team for the conference wasn't going well. The other team actually was able to assist us, and then during the switch with the other team, they were able to do work while we were able to engage in a discussion of what was going on and figure out what those dynamics were prior to the second switch when we went back to the platform work. And at that point, we could see measurable improvement in the work. And from thereafter, we saw continued improvement. That discussion and debriefing is critical, looking at how we could do the job better next time. And not only for the span that we're working the job or assignment together at the moment, but future opportunities.
Right, and again, I would say it depends on what each person brings to the table. There are times when it works and there are times when it doesn't. Just as, if I'm working with a hearing team, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So it's important to bring a team together that brings different strengths to the situation. And it's important to own our own mistakes and admit them and not blame one another for mistakes that happen. And sometimes, something doesn't work, and, the resolution of that and stopping that train from continuing to go is really in both of our hands. And it's important to sit down afterward. And it has been, in the beginning, it was very hard for me to sit down with a deaf interpreter and talk about why things went wrong. But it's important that I own my own mistakes as well, and admit those mistakes and talk about it and talk how we can improve our work for the future. And it's possible that we may not be the best team for the future. Their styles and needs may be different than my needs and my style. We may have different experiences, and maybe we just don't work well together. And I think it's important to own that as well and realize that and just be real about it.
I know that, again, that goes back to trust, to mutual respect. And in the platform setting, it's much more challenging. And I had the experience of working with one interpreter that I hadn't had a lot of experience with, and I was working to feed them, and it simply didn't go well. I felt horrid, but there were so many reasons that wasn't working well. Among them, the fact that we didn't know each other that well, the lack of experience of the team, the need to have practiced more, and also sometimes needing to recognize when that team simply just didn't work. And as Kerri said, you have to be flexible. You have to also realize that sometimes two particular people aren't the best team. Or with given time, they could be a very solid team, but shouldn't work a platform assignment until they'd had other settings, more manageable settings, to work together so that they were a compatible team. And then perhaps later in time, they would be a perfectly acceptable team for a platform job.
Wonderful answers. Okay, so moving on to our next question, which is related to the last question. And this is for the two hearing interpreters. Have there been experiences where you feed the deaf interpreter, and instead of interpreting, the deaf interpreter simply shadows what you've done? And if so, then what do you do? And what has happened in that situation? Then I feel really good, then I'm as good as the CDI. No, I'm just kidding. Really, it depends on the CDI and what their preference is. Maybe they have a lot of experience, maybe they don't. Some people are new in the field. So it depends on the person. I may continue to just feed them. I may actually take a pause hold while they, may do a translation, or I may feed them a larger chunk of information. It really depends on the person. And like you said, there are some people who prefer ASL. And I may know that this person prefers ASL, but since they're shadowing me and I'm signing more English, I may start to sign more ASL, and then I can adjust back to English. It really depends on the preferences of the person. Sometimes that's what the deaf interpreter, this person does. They shadow. That's their style. And maybe the client wants it as well.
I would probably pause and wonder why they were doing that. So at the first opportunity or break, I would approach them and ask them whether or not it was their understanding that was more the needs of the client. Because really it's about the client, the communication, clients of the communication event, really. It may be that, that day they simply were doing that. There may not be a coherent reason behind that decision. But I would absolutely check in and see.
So in your experience, Steve, do you sometimes shadow the interpreter?
Yes, sometimes I do. And sometimes I know that I can move more in one direction on the spectrum than the other. It sometimes also depends on what point we're starting from. It may depend on the setting. So I also rely on the team and will often tell the team, tell me if I'm going in the wrong direction with this on the spectrum. I may have set my compass in one direction and I'm marching forward with it, but I may need to be redirected so that I know and have some cue that I'm now reset, headed in the right direction. I may be making my decisions based on the speed of information, based on a number of factors around. But I notice that in the first few minutes, I tend to be much closer to the form that I'm fed in. But if I'm not doing that, I need some cue from my team. They have to be free to be able to give me that cue. And I think it often depends on the setting, how nervous or confident I am about the content and context of that communication event. And that has a play in what's going on internally that lends me to walk more in one direction than the other.
I would say that oftentimes when I end up shadowing, it's because I've lost my train of thought, or I'm not quite there processing the information. Maybe I feel overwhelmed with that information, and so I'm just shadowing it and giving it out as I see it. There are other times when that's the actual goal of the interpreting. So if I'm working, so one time, for example, I was working with International Sign. I don't remember the exact sign that was used here, but the interpreter fed me this specific sign, and I know that my product needed to be different than what was fed to me. And so at the break, for this particular situation, I actually spoke with the interpreter who asked me why I had changed the sign that she had fed to me. She felt like I didn't understand what she was trying to say, and that I was changing what she was asking me to use. And that, in that instance, we weren't communicating clearly. I was actually choosing to use a different sign because it was more appropriate in the international setting. Another question from someone who's out there remotely. So you may have an interpreter who does not label themselves as a hearing interpreter or as a NIC interpreter, or excuse me, we don't do that. We don't label interpreters NIC masters or certified interpreters. Why do we call deaf interpreters CDIs?
So you mean, why do I call myself a certified deaf interpreter rather than a deaf interpreter? Well, because there's a distinction between those that are certified doing the work. I think it is appropriate to call those who are not yet certified to refer to them as deaf interpreters. But being nationally certified, I would tend to call myself a certified deaf interpreter. So for me, I know that very often when I would be doing my work, I would be asked whether or not I was a hearing interpreter. There would be the assumption that I was hearing, because I simply called myself an interpreter. So I have felt the need then to include the information that I was a deaf interpreter. And for a very long time, I've simply referred to myself as a deaf interpreter. But in the larger realm, I often have to inform people that I'm not only a deaf interpreter, I'm also a certified deaf interpreter, to make that distinction. Here, very often, that distinction is important because students at Gallaudet see interpreters and deaf interpreters all the time, and that distinction is necessary. I think it's polite for me to include that information.
I think that hearing interpreters who are out there often do say that they're certified. They may not specify which certification they have, because not everybody's familiar with those certifications, but they will make sure that people know that they are certified, just as in other fields they may be licensed to do the specific work. But I wouldn't say I'm a NIC master. Now, you had also mentioned your initial unease at correcting a deaf interpreter or talking with them about mistakes. So I'm asking the deaf interpreters, are you comfortable with hearing interpreters correcting you on anything, or are there specific topics that are okay and other topics that may not be okay? Well, I see myself as an evolved person now. Really, in the past, I would think that a hearing person who would correct me was arrogant, because here I, grew up in a deaf family. I use ASL every day, and who are they to correct me? But now, of course, we all make mistakes, and I see it as human error. And oftentimes, if a hearing interpreter is reticent to give me that feedback, I will encourage them to do so. And again, it's about the product. It isn't about ego. It's not about who's better, who's right or wrong. And really, it comes down to how things are communicated. If somebody is melodramatic about it, then that doesn't work very well. If somebody very subtly uses the cues we've agreed on, maybe they lean to the side and ask just a clarifying question, then I can make those adjustments. So it depends on how it's communicated.
Well, the how of it is critical. The approach is central. How that critique is made is that criticism done in a comfortable way that's intended to be constructive and intended to help with improvement of the work, then that's great. Perhaps I've misunderstood the intent of a particular word's usage. That's important information for me to have access to as your team. You know, very often the hearing interpreter is adept at understanding the nuance of intonation or positioning of the word. And for me, I see English sort of holistically as a whole, but I don't have that inner native sense of English as a language. And that's something that we will see differently. And that's an important point where we need to reach some intersection of give and take with the languages and with the critique that happens in an appropriate, diplomatic way that's intended to enhance the end product. If it's done with arrogance, that arrogance will immediately be sensed, and that will certainly close the doors to further discussion.
When I first began interpreting, I didn't ever want to question a deaf person or their understanding of another deaf person or of their sign choice, and so that was something that I would never do. But then I was really questioned on that decision. People were asking me why I wouldn't talk about those issues. It's a language issue. You know, if we have police officer with 3 interpreters, I may have a different understanding of the situation than the person who's actually on. Or, I mean, it's important to have a dialogue about various understandings. If I were to not say anything or not question, because I can't question a deaf person, then we all suffer and the message suffers. So we're on the job, we're all processing the language, and oftentimes there are misunderstandings. So we each have to be responsible for helping the ultimate understanding of the source text and creating the target interpretation. So if there are times when a sign choice may be different than what I would have chosen, then I don't always say anything. But if the meaning has been skewed, then of course I will engage and make sure that that's corrected, or I make it clear that that was corrected. And you know, I don't look to see whether that was the best sign choice that they that they used. That's not necessarily what I would choose. But if I am actually sitting quietly and not saying anything about something that has been misinterpreted, then I'm not doing my part, and it messes up the interpretation anyway. So it's really important to get engaged and give that feedback.
I think it's really important to look at what the correction is about. Is it about a word preference, or is it about a word meaning? Is it something that's critical, or is it something that really doesn't need repair? If it's something that skews the message, then as a member of the team, it's my responsibility to bring that critique or bring the correction to the error. And it's certainly not about you made a mistake that I have to tell you about. Certainly that attitude isn't the one we want to bring forth. This is about the information that needs to be corrected. But there are certainly ways of bringing a correction to the discussion rather than simply announcing or proclaiming that an error has been made. There are appropriate ways of doing this. And once again, this goes back to my mantra of trust. We absolutely have to have that trust. If that trust is there, then you know that I'm not offering you this correction because of any other reason than the need for the correction.
And one more question before we close, or maybe a few. Hopefully we can fit in a few. So for those who have little experience and no training, what would your recommendation be? Where do those people begin? And of course, they begin in the library basement. As you all know, that's a great place to start. But if your public library is far, not close by, what can you all, what tidbits can you give to our audience? Where would they begin?
Well, Carolyn and I have done workshops together talking about deaf hearing teams, and I always suggest that you start off with not a high-profile national conference, certainly not that. Start off with something that builds your capacity from the first steps that you take. One safe entry point that I often see is church. bring a deaf hearing team together to provide interpretation services for the church sermon. And because trial and error in that setting is okay. There will be errors, especially in the beginning, but the church members as an audience are very forgiving people. I think it's a good place to start to build that capacity.
Okay, again, I was talking about technology. We have YouTube, and on YouTube there are a plethora of videotapes that people can really practice with. Even now, if I'm working with a new hearing interpreter who I've never worked with before, oftentimes we come together and do a dry run. Maybe we practice with, I don't know how you actually say that, but maybe the other person on the panel can.
The interpreter actually voiced it right, so go right ahead.
Oh, okay, right. So we do a dry run. So we sit together and can make some adjustments, can talk about how I want to be fed or how this person feeds, so that we have a safe place to actually practice, to learn from one another before we actually have to do the work. Any other comments? If you're talking about training, you can look for various workshops. Hopefully there will be deaf people involved in those workshops so that you can team with them and practice in the workshop. If you have some experience in interpreting and you are skilled, maybe you want to join the RVI program at Gallaudet Interpreting Services. We have various cohorts. We have CDIs who will be coming and getting training for a year. We have hearing interpreters who are training for a year. So if you want to do that, you can do that. Or if you want to pursue education, you can get a BA or a master's in interpreting. And more deaf people are joining those programs and getting their degrees. And therefore, you can really practice working in teams. And once you graduate, then the working world is open for you. There are people who you've at that time then already worked with, and you can go out into the field and start working in teams. So and then you also want to just talk with people where they are, where the skills are, and how they want to move forward. So I encourage people to come to this area if they're interested.
Well, if there are a group of interpreters, for example, who haven't had a lot of experience, they can come together and do group work practicing. So you can do role plays where you are doing consecutive interpretation in, say, a fishbowl exercise with others observing, one person in the role of doctor, interpreter, and such. And that's one way to build that comfort and experience working in that setting. And you can also examine the inter-team dynamics and different teaming combinations. And so you can set up perhaps these teaming dyads that then can work in small local settings, as one of your chapter meetings for your local RID affiliate organization. Then can use some of those interpreting dyads who've worked in your group work. Then you can find other sorts of settings to work in as well. Following that up, gradually increasing the level of complexity and difficulty of that setting and environment, rather than trying to aspire to begin your work with deaf hearing teams in the legal arena where it's incredibly difficult.
So it seems we are almost out of time, and I would just want to thank my friends and colleagues for joining me in the library basement right here, which is my home. And thank you to the panelists, and thank you to the audience members who are here in the room. And I actually have a number of questions here that have not been answered. And so hopefully we will continue this dialogue as a learning community. And again, thank you.
This has been a production of Gallaudet University.